Judge Crawford laughed at the black teen in a wheelchair, thinking she was just another troublemaker. She had no idea that Maya Johnson carried a folder full of evidence that would destroy her career and change the entire court system forever. Before watching full story, comment below from "Were you watching? Also like and subscribe for more stories." Judge Patricia Crawford's laughter echoed through Courtroom 7 like a cruel slap across the face of justice itself. What she didn't know was that the 17-year-old black girl in the wheelchair before her wasn't just another defendant. She was about to become the catalyst for the most significant judicial reform in the state's history. In the span of one explosive hour, Maya Johnson would transform from accused vandal to civil rights hero, armed with nothing but a manila folder and the kind of courage that reshapes entire systems. The morning air was crisp with autumn tension as Maya Johnson maneuvered her motorized wheelchair through the imposing granite corridors of the county courthouse. Each rotation of her wheels carried her closer to a confrontation that would either destroy her future or expose a web of systematic discrimination so vast it would shock federal investigators. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was being prosecuted for vandalism she couldn't physically have committed by a system designed to protect people like her. Hidden in Maya's wheelchair bag was a manila folder that contained what prosecutors would later call the most comprehensive documentation of judicial bias ever, compiled by a minor. For 14 months, while her peers worried about prom dates and college applications, Maya had been methodically tracking every suspension, every disciplinary action, every unequal punishment handed down in her school district. What she discovered was so damning that federal authorities were already watching her case, waiting to see if the system would try to silence the young researcher who had exposed their darkest secrets. The judge who underestimated everything, Judge Patricia Crawford, had built her career on swift justice and harsh sentences, particularly for defendants who didn't know their place. With her designer glasses and silver hair pulled into a severe bun, she ruled her courtroom like a queen dispensing judgment from on high. She had seen hundreds of teenagers pass through her court, and to her, Maya Johnson was just another troubled youth who needed to learn respect for authority. What Crawford didn't realize was that Maya had been studying her, tracking her sentencing patterns, documenting her biases, building a case that would end Crawford's career in spectacular fashion, the folder that would change history. As Maya wheeled into position at the defendant's table, her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of what she carried. The folder in her bag contained 247 documented cases of discriminatory punishment, statistical analyses that would make federal prosecutors salivate, and evidence of a conspiracy so systematic it reached from school hallways to judicial chambers. She had spent months preparing for this moment, never imagining that her high school research project would become the foundation for a Department of Justice investigation. The moment truth collided with power. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead in Courtroom 7 as 17-year-old Maya Johnson wheeled herself through the heavy oak doors. Her motorized wheelchair made a soft whirring sound that seemed to echo in the austere chamber. She wore her best outfit, a navy blue cardigan over a white blouse that her grandmother had pressed with care that morning. Despite her nervous energy, Maya's dark eyes held a steely determination that would soon shake the foundations of the county's justice system. Judge Patricia Crawford barely glanced up from her papers as the bailiff announced the next case. The People versus Maya Johnson, charged with vandalism and trespassing at Jefferson High School. Judge Crawford's voice carried the bored tone of someone who had seen hundreds of similar cases. She was a woman in her late 50s, with silver hair pulled back severely and designer glasses that cost more than most families' monthly grocery bills. Maya's court-appointed attorney, David Walsh, shuffled through his overflowing briefcase with obvious discomfort. He had met Maya for exactly 12 minutes before the hearing, spending most of that time explaining why she should accept a plea deal rather than fighting the charges. "Your Honor," Walsh began hesitantly, "my client is prepared to accept responsibility for—" "I'm not accepting any plea," Maya interrupted, her voice clear and strong despite the intimidating surroundings. Several people in the gallery shifted in their seats, surprised by the teenager's boldness. Judge Crawford's eyebrows rose slightly. "Excuse me? Young lady, your attorney is speaking for you." "With respect, Your Honor, I can speak for myself." Maya's hands remained steady on her wheelchair's controls, even as her heart raced. I was wrongfully arrested and I have evidence to prove it. A slight smirk played at the corners of Judge Crawford's mouth. Evidence? How refreshing. Please enlighten us with your evidence, Miss Johnson. The condescension in the judge's tone was unmistakable, and several observers in the courtroom exchanged uncomfortable glances. Maya reached into the bag attached to her wheelchair and pulled out a thick manila folder, its edges worn from repeated handling. For the past 14 months, I've been documenting patterns of discrimination in our school district's disciplinary system, Maya began, opening the folder to reveal meticulously organized charts, graphs, and handwritten notes. Students with disabilities are suspended at 3 times the rate of non-disabled students for identical infractions. Black students with disabilities face even harsher penalties. Judge Crawford leaned back in her chair, her smirk widening. Oh, how fascinating. A teenage sociologist in my courtroom. Tell me, Miss Johnson, did you conduct this research before or after you decided to spray paint profanity on school property? I didn't spray paint anything, Maya replied firmly. I was in the school library after hours conducting interviews with other students about their disciplinary experiences. I had written permission from the librarian, Mrs. Chen, who stayed late to supervise my research. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Robert Lynch, stood up. Your Honor, there's no record of any such permission in the case file. Maya's eyes flashed. That's because no one bothered to investigate. They saw a black girl in a wheelchair near graffiti and assumed guilt. Judge Crawford laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that cut through the courtroom like a blade. Assumed guilt? Miss Johnson, you were found at the scene with spray paint on your hands. Paint from an art therapy session earlier that day, Maya countered, producing a receipt from her folder. Here's the documentation from my occupational therapy appointment. The paint was acrylic, not spray paint. Different chemical composition entirely. For the first time, Judge Crawford's confident expression wavered slightly. She glanced at the prosecutor, who was frantically flipping through his own papers. Furthermore, Maya continued, her voice gaining strength, the graffiti was sprayed 6 feet high on the wall. I'm in a wheelchair. The physics don't work. She gestured to her position, making the obvious point that even the judge couldn't dismiss. A murmur rippled through the gallery. In the back row, a woman in a sharp business suit made a note on her tablet. Her attention focused intently on the proceedings. Judge Crawford's face flushed slightly. That's enough theatrics, Miss Johnson. Physical limitations don't preclude someone from using tools or accomplices. Accomplices? Maya's voice rose with indignation. Your Honor, are you seriously suggesting I orchestrated a graffiti conspiracy because I'm black and disabled? I'm suggesting, Judge Crawford snapped, that you show respect for this court and stop trying to turn your criminal behavior into some sort of civil rights crusade. The woman in the back row stood up suddenly. Your Honor, I'd like to enter an appearance as counsel for Miss Johnson. Judge Crawford looked up sharply. And you are? Attorney Sarah Goldberg from the Civil Rights Legal Foundation. My organization has been monitoring this case. Goldberg approached the bench, her credentials already in hand. I move to dismiss all charges against Miss Johnson due to prosecutorial misconduct and inadequate investigation. Denied, Judge Crawford said quickly. This case will proceed as scheduled. Then I request a brief recess to properly review the evidence Miss Johnson has compiled. Goldberg continued smoothly. Evidence that apparently wasn't considered during the initial investigation. Maya opened her folder wider, revealing hundreds of pages of documentation. Your Honor, I've tracked 247 disciplinary incidents across 3 high schools in this district over the past 14 months. The statistical disparities are undeniable. Statistical disparities? Judge Crawford laughed again, but this time the sound seemed forced. Miss Johnson, this is a criminal courtroom, not a sociology classroom. Justice should be informed by facts, Your Honor, Maya replied. These facts show that disabled students of color receive harsher punishment 73% more often than their white, non-disabled peers for identical infractions. Attorney Goldberg stepped forward. Your Honor, Miss Johnson's research has already been reviewed by the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. They've opened an investigation into the school district based on her findings. The color drained from Judge Crawford's face. The Department of Justice? Maya reached into her folder again, this time producing an official letter on DOJ letterhead. They contacted me 3 weeks ago. My research provided the statistical evidence they needed to establish a pattern of civil rights violations. Judge Crawford snatched the letter from Maya's hands, her eyes scanning the official document rapidly. The courtroom fell silent except for the soft rustle of papers. "This is highly irregular," the judge muttered. Clearly shaken. "What's irregular?" Maya said, her voice steady and clear. "Is a justice system that punishes people for documenting injustice instead of addressing it." A man in the gallery stood up, his press badge visible on his jacket. "Your Honor, I'm Marcus Williams from the State Tribune. We've been following Miss Johnson's research for months. Her documentation has already led to 2 federal investigations and the resignation of 1 school administrator." More reporters seemed to materialize from the gallery, their recording devices and cameras suddenly visible. Judge Crawford looked around the courtroom with growing panic, realizing that what she thought was a routine juvenile case had become something much larger. "Miss Johnson," a woman's voice called from the gallery. An elderly black woman with silver hair and kind eyes stood up. "I'm Dr. Ruth Washington, former superintendent of the Metro School District. I'd like to testify as a character witness." Judge Crawford's hands trembled slightly as she tried to maintain control. "This is highly unusual. Character witnesses aren't typically—" "Your Honor," Dr. Washington interrupted gently. "Maya Johnson spent 6 months volunteering in my office, helping develop new inclusive disciplinary policies. Her research identified problems we'd been struggling to quantify for years." Maya turned to look at Dr. Washington with surprise and gratitude. She hadn't known the former superintendent was in the courtroom. "In fact," Dr. Washington continued, "Maya's work has been so impressive that she's been offered a full scholarship to study criminal justice reform at Howard University." The scholarship committee specifically cited her commitment to evidence-based advocacy for marginalized communities. A hush fell over the courtroom. Judge Crawford stared at Maya with new understanding, seeing not just a teenager in a wheelchair, but a young civil rights researcher whose work was already creating ripple effects throughout the system. Attorney Goldberg seized the moment. "Your Honor, I submit that Miss Johnson was not committing vandalism on the night in question, but rather conducting legitimate research into systemic discrimination. Research that has since been validated by federal investigators and academic institutions." Maya wheeled closer to the bench, her folder still open. "Your Honor, I didn't set out to become an activist. I just wanted to understand why I was being suspended more often than my white classmates for the same behaviors. What I discovered was a pattern of bias so consistent it could only be intentional." She pulled out a specific chart, holding it up for the court to see. "In this school district, a white student caught fighting receives an average suspension of 3.2 days. A black student with a disability caught fighting receives 8.7 days for the same offense. That's not justice, that's systematic oppression." Judge Crawford's composure finally cracked completely. "Miss Johnson, This court wasn't aware of the broader context of your research." "Respectfully, Your Honor," Maya replied. "This court didn't bother to investigate the broader context. You saw a black girl in a wheelchair and assumed the worst." The truth of that statement hung in the air like an indictment. Judge Crawford realized that dozens of observers, including journalists and civil rights advocates, had witnessed her dismissive treatment of Maya. A commotion at the back of the courtroom drew everyone's attention. A man in an expensive suit was entering with several associates. "Your Honor, I'm Federal Prosecutor James Chen with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. We're here regarding ongoing investigations into discriminatory practices in this jurisdiction." Judge Crawford's face went pale. "Federal prosecutors? In my courtroom? Miss Johnson's research has provided crucial evidence for multiple federal investigations," Prosecutor Chen explained. "We've been monitoring this case to ensure there's no retaliation against a key witness in our civil rights probe." Maya felt a surge of vindication mixed with nervous energy. She had never imagined her research would reach the federal level. Attorney Goldberg stepped forward again. "Your Honor, in light of these revelations, I renew my motion to dismiss all charges against Miss Johnson. The evidence clearly shows she was wrongfully accused." Judge Crawford looked around the courtroom, taking in the reporters, federal prosecutors, civil rights advocates, and community members who had gathered. Her usual position of unquestioned authority had evaporated. "Miss Johnson," she said slowly, "this court owes you an apology. Your charges are dismissed immediately." Her voice barely carried across the suddenly quiet courtroom. Maya felt tears of relief and triumph welling up in her eyes, but she maintained her composure. "Thank you, Your Honor, but dismissing my charges doesn't address the systematic problems I've documented." "What do you propose?" Judge Crawford asked, her tone now respectful rather than condescending. Maya consulted her folder one final time. "I propose that this court system implement mandatory bias training for all judges and court personnel. I propose regular auditing of sentencing patterns to identify disparities, and I propose that disabled defendants have the right to accommodations that ensure fair treatment." Federal Prosecutor Chen nodded approvingly. The Department of Justice would support those reforms as part of our ongoing investigation. Dr. Washington stood again. The University Scholarship Board would be happy to provide Miss Johnson with a platform to present her recommendations to state legislators. Maya looked around the courtroom at the faces watching, her some with admiration, others with surprise, but all with a new level of respect. 6 months ago, she had been just another student frustrated by unfair treatment. Today, her methodical documentation had exposed systematic bias and set in motion reforms that would help countless other students. "Your Honor," Maya said, "I hope this case demonstrates that justice isn't just about individual cases. It's about ensuring the system works fairly for everyone, especially those who are most vulnerable." Judge Crawford nodded slowly. "Miss Johnson, you've taught this court an important lesson about the difference between hearing a case and truly listening. Court is adjourned." As the gavel fell, the courtroom erupted in quiet conversation. Reporters approached Maya for interviews, civil rights advocates introduced themselves, and Dr. Washington waited patiently to speak with her former volunteer. Maya's grandmother, who had been sitting quietly in the third row throughout the proceedings, wheeled her way through the crowd. "I knew you had something special in you, baby girl," she said, embracing Maya tightly. "Your grandfather would be so proud." Attorney Goldberg approached with a warm smile. "Maya, the Civil Rights Legal Foundation would like to offer you an internship this summer. Your research methodology is exactly what we need for future cases." As Maya left the courthouse that day, she reflected on how the experience had changed her. She had entered as a defendant, wrongfully accused and facing punishment for something she didn't do. She was leaving as a civil rights researcher whose work was already creating meaningful change. The security footage from Jefferson High School was reviewed that same evening. It clearly showed Maya in the library during the time the vandalism occurred, working with Mrs. Chen on her research project. The real vandals were identified within a week, 3 white students who received minimal consequences for their actions. Maya's research continued to generate impact long after her court appearance. The school district implemented new disciplinary policies based on her recommendations. 2 principals resigned after their departments were found to have deliberately discriminated against disabled students of color. 3 months later, Maya testified before the state legislature about the need for educational equity reforms. Her presentation, delivered with the same calm confidence she had shown in Judge Crawford's courtroom, led to new state laws requiring regular audits of school disciplinary practices. Judge Crawford, humbled by the experience, volunteered to lead judicial bias training programs throughout the state. She often referenced Maya's case as an example of how assumptions and prejudices could corrupt the pursuit of justice. Maya's scholarship to Howard University included a research stipend that allowed her to expand her work to juvenile justice systems in other states. Her methodology for documenting systematic bias became a model for advocacy organizations nationwide. On graduation day, as Maya received her high school diploma with highest honors, she thought about that terrifying day in Judge Crawford's courtroom. She had entered that room as a victim of the system's bias, but she had left as an agent of change. The manila folder that had started as a school project now resided in the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Recognized as an example of how young people can challenge injustice through methodical documentation and unwavering courage, Maya's story spread through social media and civil rights networks, inspiring other young people to document unfairness in their own communities. Her example showed that systematic change often begins with one person willing to count, document, and speak truth to power. In the weeks following her court victory, Maya's phone rang constantly with interview requests. National news outlets wanted to feature her story, but Maya insisted that the focus remain on the systematic issues rather than her personal triumph. During a particularly powerful interview with CNN, she stated, "This isn't about me being exceptional. This is about a system that's so broken that a high school student with a notebook can expose decades of discrimination." The ripple effects of Maya's case extended far beyond the courthouse. Within 2 months, 3 other judges in neighboring counties had resigned after similar patterns were discovered in their courtrooms. The state attorney general launched a comprehensive review of all juvenile court proceedings from the past 5 years, using Maya's methodology as a template for identifying bias. Dr. Washington arranged for Maya to present her findings at a national conference on juvenile justice reform. Standing before an audience of judges, attorneys, and policymakers, Maya delivered a presentation that would later be called the most impactful 20 minutes in recent civil rights history. Her PowerPoint slides, filled with charts and statistics, told a story of systematic oppression that left many in the audience speechless. "When I started documenting these patterns," Maya told the conference, "I thought I was just trying to understand why I kept getting in trouble at school. I had no idea I was uncovering a pipeline that pushes disabled students of color out of education and into the justice system." The data Maya presented was staggering. Disabled black students were 4.2 times more likely to be arrested at school than their white peers. They received out-of-school suspensions at nearly 6 times the rate. Most troubling, they were referred to law enforcement for behaviors that white students were counseled for or given warnings about. Federal prosecutor Chen attended Maya's conference presentation and approached her afterward with a proposal that would change the trajectory of her young life. "Maya," he said, "the Department of Justice is creating a new Youth Advisory Council on civil rights enforcement. We need someone with your analytical skills and lived experience to help us identify systematic problems before they become entrenched." Maya's grandmother, watching her granddaughter field offers from universities, law firms, and government agencies, marveled at the transformation. "6 months ago you were afraid to speak up in class," she observed. "Now senators are calling the House asking for your opinion on federal legislation." The truth was that Maya's confidence hadn't appeared overnight. It had been built through months of meticulous research, through learning to trust her observations, and through the validation that came when powerful institutions finally acknowledged what she had been documenting all along. The folder that started as a desperate attempt to prove she wasn't imagining discrimination had become a weapon against systematic injustice. Attorney Goldberg invited Maya to join her firm's summer internship program, but not as a typical high school volunteer. "We want you to lead our new youth advocacy division," Goldberg explained. "Your research model needs to be replicated in communities across the country." The internship took Maya to juvenile courts in 12 different states, where she trained other young people to document bias using her statistical methods. In Atlanta, she worked with a group of Latina students who were tracking discriminatory disciplinary practices in their schools. In Phoenix, she helped Native American youth document how tribal students were treated differently in state courts. Each location revealed the same patterns Maya had first identified in her own community. The specific numbers varied, but the systematic nature of the discrimination was consistent. Disabled students of color were being pushed out of schools and into courts at alarming rates, while white students with similar behaviors received support and second chances. Maya's methodology became known as the Johnson Protocol among civil rights attorneys. Her approach of combining quantitative data with qualitative observations created a new standard for documenting systematic bias. Law schools began teaching courses based on her research techniques, and advocacy organizations adopted her framework for identifying discrimination, the financial settlement from the class action lawsuit against Maya's school district created a scholarship fund for students with disabilities who were pursuing degrees in law, social work, or education. Maya was named to the fund's advisory board, making her the youngest member of a board that included former federal judges and civil rights leaders. Judge Crawford's transformation became almost as notable as Maya's rise. After completing mandatory bias training, Crawford requested assignment to a family court specializing in cases involving disabled youth. She spent her weekends volunteering at advocacy organizations, using her judicial experience to help other young people navigate the legal system. During one particularly moving encounter, Crawford approached Maya at a civil rights conference. "I want you to know," the former judge said, "that you didn't just change my courtroom. You changed me. I spent 20 years on the bench thinking I was dispensing justice, when I was actually perpetuating harm. Maya's response reflected the wisdom she had gained through her ordeal. Judge Crawford, the system failed both of us. It taught you to see people like me as problems to be solved, rather than people to be protected. It taught me that I had to prove my worth rather than simply existing with dignity. The National Merit Scholarship that had started Maya's research journey evolved into something much larger. The organization created the Maya Johnson Fellowship for young researchers documenting systematic inequality. Recipients received full college scholarships and were paired with civil rights attorneys to ensure their research led to policy changes. Maya's own college choice surprised many who expected her to attend an Ivy League institution. Instead, she chose a historically black university known for its civil rights law program. "I want to learn from people who have been fighting these battles for generations," she explained. "My research gave me tools, but I need wisdom about how to use them effectively." Her freshman year at Howard University was unlike that of typical students. Maya arrived on campus already known to professors and administrators, her research having been cited in multiple federal court cases. She was invited to guest lecture in graduate-level courses and served on the university's committee reviewing campus accessibility policies. The manila folder that had started everything was preserved in the university's civil rights archive, but Maya kept detailed copies. She continued adding to her research, now tracking patterns of discrimination in higher education. Her sophomore year project focused on how disabled students of color were steered away from challenging academic programs and toward vocational tracks. Maya's influence extended beyond academia into popular culture. A documentary about her case aired on Netflix, reaching millions of viewers and inspiring other young people to document injustice in their own communities. The film's most powerful moment showed the courtroom footage of Judge Crawford's initial dismissive treatment, contrasted with Maya's calm, evidence-based responses. The documentary sparked congressional hearings on juvenile justice reform. Maya testified before the House Judiciary Committee, her wheelchair positioned at a table where she faced dozens of legislators. Her testimony, delivered without notes, laid out a comprehensive plan for addressing systematic bias in courts nationwide. "Honorable members," Maya said, "the question isn't whether bias exists in our justice system. My research proves it does. The question is whether we have the courage to acknowledge it and the commitment to change it." Her recommendations included mandatory data collection on sentencing patterns, regular bias audits of judicial decisions, and the creation of youth advocacy positions in every federal court district. All three recommendations were incorporated into federal legislation passed the following year. Maya's impact on Judge Crawford's former courtroom was particularly profound. The new judge, Honorable Maria Santos, implemented Maya's suggestions for accommodating disabled defendants and established regular community forums where citizens could discuss their experiences with the court system. The physical courtroom itself was redesigned, based on Maya's recommendations. The judge's bench was lowered to reduce intimidation, accessible seating was installed throughout the gallery, and assistive technology was provided for defendants with communication disabilities. As Maya prepared for her junior year of college, she reflected on how her relationship with that original manila folder had evolved. What began as documentation born from frustration had become a blueprint for systemic change. The scared teenager who entered Judge Crawford's courtroom had transformed into a nationally recognized advocate whose work was reshaping how America thought about justice. The scholarship offers continued to arrive, but Maya had already chosen her path. After completing her undergraduate degree, she planned to attend law school and eventually run for public office. Her long-term goal was to become a federal judge herself, bringing lived experience with discrimination to the bench. Maya's story had become required reading in civil rights courses across the country, but she remained focused on the work ahead, rather than past achievements. In her dorm room, a new folder sat on her desk, this one tracking patterns of employment discrimination against disabled people of color. The research never stopped, because the fight for justice never ended. The plaque in Courtroom 7 bore a simple inscription that captured the essence of Maya's journey. Justice is not a destination, but a direction. It requires constant vigilance, documented evidence, and the courage to speak truth to power. Below it was a quote from Maya herself. Systematic injustice thrives in darkness, but it withers when exposed to the light of documented evidence and unwavering determination. Maya Johnson had learned that her wheelchair had never been a limitation. It had been her platform for creating change that would benefit countless others who followed in her path. The young woman who once documented discrimination to prove she wasn't imagining it had become living proof that one person's documented truth could transform an entire system.